Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back to lecture number 19 of the public policy analysis, and now we are gradually moving towards the end part of this class that would begin with I would suppose with the 20th lecture. Now the way I intend to go about this thing is that I'd be planning to get done with all the theoretical stuff and all the coverage what we intend to cover in this class by maybe 25th 26th lecture. And in the last few lectures I just want to go through lots of examples that you would probably encounter and I encountered in policy making, which kind of would give you a heads up, a start on what kind of problems do we encountered in policy making in the country. Then perhaps and besides that I'll be giving you some documents too for reading, which would be helpful for you in getting up to date with this, how policy making is done at the government level and what kind of methodology is employed over there. By the end of the course, it is my intention that you'll have gone through a lot of things, a lot of examples, and seen what it takes and seen and experience what it means to be a policy maker and how to go about this thing. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll do that. Of course, you'll be learning many new things. I studied these things a lot during my time as a student. We used to study quite a lot, but then in the real world I found that there are new aspects, new dimensions that I didn't encounter in my studies, and I gradually learned. I looked at them, I studied them, and gradually looked at the procedure. And that is what's going to happen to you. This is class is just about giving you tools, a heads up start on what this is and how normally we go about this stuff. But it's not intended to make you master of all this stuff. Of course, I would like you to be master of all this kind of stuff, master this kind of stuff, but as I said that you cannot cover every dimension of policy making. Practical life is different in the sense that you would be experiencing new things, new ways of doing work. Experience cannot be measured. There is no substitute for experience. So anyway, let us go ahead with this lecture. And first of all, the previous lecture, we went through the graphical analysis and description of producer surplus again. We did some part in the lecture before the previous lecture. Then this one, the last one, that was concentrated, if you remember, on depicting the specific areas of producer surplus that in a perfectly comparative or competitive model of Pareto optimality that we were looking at. We did all that analysis. We drew all those graphs, we drew all those areas, rectangular areas that tended to show all this surplus, and then we discussed why in the long run we expect, at least theoretically, to producers be producing at the break-even point, which was the equilibrium point. Remember, that was the point where the marginal cost curve, it cuts the average cost curve. That is the break-even point, and we expect producers to be there in the long run simply because in perfect competition or a competitive model there are no barriers to entry and exit. So once the firms, other firms, they witness this particular production in this industry picking up pace because prices have gone up, and there is profit to be made, then since there are no barriers to entry, they will enter this market, and in the long run, with the entry of new participants or new producers, as the production increases, the prices would gradually come down, and ultimately they come down to the break-even level. So that was at least the theory, and then we discussed some of the aspects of the theory, some of the problems with the theory, like incomplete information, hoarding, not having the most rational people. These are some of the problems with these kind of theories, the general equilibrium theory, the comparative model. You need to have a lot of information, you need to have the right ideas, the right models, and almost anything that is included in it to be perfect, which unfortunately is not the case. No, not in the real world. As I mentioned in my last lecture, it would be difficult for you to find an economy that runs on perfect competition. There are some examples. That are near to that, but not exactly that. So it remains a theoretical model. But in the real world, maybe some economies maybe come close to it, have come close to it over time, but they are not what we say perfectly competitive economies, or the ones who follow on the comparative ideals of a Pareto optimal economy. No. Shortcomings of the comparative optimal and general equilibrium models. A brief introduction to the concept of elasticity. Remember, I said that elasticity has to do with seeing or trying to observe changes in one variable or one good that has an effect upon unrelated goods. I gave you the example of oil and wheat. The nature of these products are different, but one tends to have effect upon the other in terms of prices. And what elasticity helps us does is that it helps us compare these uneven products or products of different nature. Then it gives us a number, a percentage number, that we can say that look, the price of oil, which has increased by this percent, let's say 5%, it has induced a decline in consumption by around 2%, 3%. So it gives us that number in percentage. That is not possible to get with simple demand and supply analysis, which does valuations or this kind of valuation across the same nature of commodities, not exactly different commodities. Then we went, I believe we went through the concept of inelastic and elastic curves, and that included both demand and supply curves. We said that if suppose the increase or decrease in consumption in demand for a product is less than the increase or decrease in price, then that would be an inelastic curve, demand curve. I'm talking about demand curve. Similarly, if it is the other way around, that price increase or decrease induces a much bigger quantity increase or decrease as far as consumption is concerned, demand is concerned, then that would be an elastic curve. Now this distinction between elastic demand curve and an inelastic demand curve, that also holds true, is similar when we are talking about the supply curve. Now this one was elastic and inelastic, but what was another concept we discussed? Unit elastic. What was unit elastic? That if suppose there is a price increase or decrease of 5%, then the quantity increase decrease or the quantity supply quantity demanded or the quantity supplied increase or decrease is exactly similar, it's 5%, then that is unit elastic curve. That normally doesn't happen. Either it's inelastic or either it's elastic. In Pakistan's case, most of the stuff seems to be inelastic for some reason, because prices keep rising, and of course the quantity demanded is somewhat there. I gave you the example of water, that what would you do without it? Well, even if there is a difference of 500 rupees within one day of a water tanker, it's a necessity, you can't do without it, there is no substitute. So the consumer, he'll have to buy that. And another important thing that I remember, and I haven't written over here, that I discussed, was the economic incidence and statutory incidence of tax. I gave you this water tank. I just remembered when I mentioned this water tanker that I gave you the example of economic incidence and statutory incidence of tax. And in this regard, it was in this regard that I gave you this example, that you have to differentiate in policy making. When it comes to policy analyzing and policy making, it is extremely important that you analyze on whom the burden of taxes would fall. That is economic incidence. It's another matter, it's an administrative matter, the statutory incidence, that you notify something, government notifies that we are going to tax a certain people or a certain group or a certain industry. But what is more important is that who bears the burden of that tax. Is that the producer? Is it the consumer? And the example that I gave you of water supply, in that case it was the consumers who would ultimately bear the burden of that tax, the economic incidence of that tax. So you need to be able to distinguish between those. Moving on to this lecture, let's first go through some of the very basic stuff, graphical analysis of that is based on elasticity. I'll try to show you how inelastic and elastic demand curves are graphed, and then the all important distinction, all important application of elasticity to taxation, which would be of utmost importance for any public policy analyzer and designer. So let's start with this very simple concept of elasticity and how we represent elastic and inelastic demand curves. So suppose I first go ahead and draw a simple x-axis, y-axis, everything seems to begin with it and end with it. This is a very simple graph. Again an x-axis, y-axis. Now this is the case of an inelastic demand curve. Let me just write it down. Inelastic demand curve is relatively steep, meaning that it's not flat. But what exactly do I mean by steep? You'll know when I draw this thing. It is something like this. Now remember, if you remember from the simple demand and supply analysis, in the simple demand and supply analysis, the elasticity, the demand curve was something like this, and the supply curve was something like this. But this is a unit elastic demand curve. But when we are talking about inelastic demand curve, or the one that as we'll see doesn't respond very well to price changes, it's something like this, the demand curve. And this is what I drew over here. So what happens when the demand curve is inelastic? Let me also just write D with it to help you out on this one. So this is a inelastic demand curve, as I mentioned above. So why is it inelastic? Let's do a simple analysis. Over here it meets, this is the original equilibrium, where at price P1 the consumption is Q1. Suppose there is a increase in price over here till this point, P1 to P2. Now it meets the demand curve, the inelastic demand curve over here. Extend it to over here, and that would be Q2. Now clearly Q1 and Q2 look like twin sisters, but they are not. Anyway, clearly you can see that this area of the price change is much bigger than this area of the quantity change. Price changes this way, quantity changes this way. This would tell you, as we discussed in the last one, and even in this lecture I just went through this thing, that in the case of inelastic demand curve and even in inelastic supply curve, what happens is that the percentage change in price is more than the percentage change in quantity. The resulting percentage change in quantity demanded is much lower than the percentage change in prices. So and how can you show that? Just look at the areas, just look at these areas over here. Look at this area, and look at this area which depicts the quantity change. Which one is bigger? Which one is larger? Obviously this one. So that depicts inelastic demand curve. Now this one was inelastic demand curve. How about this one? Try to guess. Now you can see that if price P1 increases from P1 to P2, there is a change in quantity from Q1 to Q2. Which area is bigger? This one or this one? Obviously this one. The quantity, the change in quantity due to a change in price is much bigger than the much bigger in this case. So this one is what? This one is an elastic demand curve. Remember what we said about elastic demand curves is that the change in demand is much higher than the change in price. Now this one was for demand curves. How about supply curves? Let's move towards supply curve. Let me give you a demonstration. Again, the x-axis, the y-axis. This is the two-dimensional holy grail of graphing in almost every science. Remember the supply curve again. This is the normal supply curve that we and demand curve. It looks something like this. So what if there is the supply curve is inelastic? We said about inelasticity is that it is steep. It is something like this. So what if there is a price change? Suppose this is the original one where at price P1 the total supply is Q1. Increase the price to P2 and the resulting change in quantity supplied. Remember there is a positive relationship, and price induces a increase in supply. That's why this supply curve is upward sloping or positive slope. Now again, just look at the areas over here. Which area is bigger? This one, obviously, compared to this one. What does that tell you? It tells you that this is an inelastic demand curve, supply curve, sorry. Inelastic supply curve, because the price increase is much bigger than the increase in quantity over here. That means that it's highly inelastic. But in contrast, take this case of this supply curve. So there is a price P1 over here, and there is price P2 over here. So P1 increases from P1, price increases from P1 to P2. This is the original quantity. This is what happens when price increases from P1 to P2. This is what the supply is. Now, which area is bigger? This one. And what is it? An elastic supply curve. So, hopefully this one was easier for you and you had no problem in grasping the concept of elastic, inelastic supply curve and demand curves. Now that you've understood this, let us move towards the all important concept of application of elasticity to taxation. So now let us and who bears the burden? Who bears the burden? Now let's suppose that in the case of the first one, so let's consider the first case. The case over here that I am going to discuss in this one, it is related to an inelastic demand curve and an elastic supply curve. So suppose you have to impose a tax. There is a tax but let's analyze graphically what would happen if a tax is imposed. So suppose, let's begin with this thing. There you go, our y-axis and the horizontal x-axis. Oops, this is not supposed to happen. Here you go. The simple x and y. This is the price. This is the quantity. Remember we said that the demand curve is inelastic in this case. Let me just write it down. Case 1. Demand curve is inelastic. And how do you in fact draw a highly inelastic demand curve? Just like this one, a steep one. Sorry. Here you go, that's a more straight line. More straight line, in fact, this is the demand curve. And suppose that the supply curve is elastic. Demand curve is inelastic, supply is S stand for supply, S is elastic. And how do you draw an elastic supply curve? Like this. So there is your equilibrium over here. This is the equilibrium price P1. At P1 Q1 production is taking place. Let us mark this as O as the origin, which we should always do. I usually forget, but try to write it down all the time. O, which is the origin, the start point. Anyway, this is what a simple demand and supply curve in this case, when demand curve is inelastic and supply is elastic, it means. So suppose there is an increase, there is a tax imposed. There is a tax imposed in this case which makes the price rise, which there is a tax imposed on the supplier. And he decreases his supply. For the sake of argument, let's say he decreases his supply, or there is a price increase, in fact, over here. Yes, so we just said that suppose any tax is levied, किसी भी किस्म का टैक्स इस पे लग जाता है, डजंट मैटर किस किस्म का हम लोग टैक्स लगा रहे हैं, लेकिन हमें ये चीज़ पता है, इधर इम्पोर्टेंट कंसिडरेशन ये है कि टैक्स जो लगाया जा रहा है उससे पहले वो जो पॉलिसी मेकर जो टैक्स अप्लाई करने वाला है, जो टैक्स इम्पोज करने वाला है, जो टैक्स डिज़ाइन करने वाला है, उसको ये पता है कि डिमांड कर्व इनइलास्टिक है और सप्लाई कर्व इलास्टिक है. तो इस मामले में सपोज कि हमने कहा कि कोई भी ऐसा टैक्स इम्पोज हुआ जिसकी वजह से सप्लाई जो है इट शिफ्टेड आउटवर्ड, प्राइस इंक्रीज होगी सपोज इसमें. आई एम जस्ट सेइंग फॉर द सेक ऑफ आर्ग्यूमेंट, अदरवाइज नॉर्मली प्राइस इंक्रीजेस द सप्लाई. एनीवे, अब यहाँ पे आप देखें कि ये एक पूरा एरिया आ गया. इसके साथ आप जब ये नई पुरानी सप्लाई कर्व है, द ओल्ड वन, इसको आप एक्सटेंड करेंगे यहाँ पे, तो ये एक एरिया भी आ जाएगा. ये पूरा एरिया जो है ये प्राइस इंक्रीज की वजह से एक, यू कैन कंसिडर इट एज अ लॉस. जो टैक्स इम्पोज होता है, ये पूरा एरिया जो है ये टैक्स के बराबर है जितना टैक्स इम्पोज किया गया, टोटल एरिया, यानी P2 P1. बल्कि इनफैक्ट चलें इसको मैं यहाँ पे A लिख लेता हूँ, इसको B कर लेता हूँ, इसको C कर लेता हूँ, इस पॉइंट को. सो टोटल टैक्स जो इम्पोज किया गया है वो बराबर है P2 A B P1 के बराबर है. अब ये टोटल टैक्स है, लेकिन इसमें से अब कंज्यूमर को कितना देना पड़ेगा और प्रोड्यूसर को कितना देना पड़ेगा। प्रोड्यूसर को जो है, जो सप्लाई कर्व के अलोंग है, वो सिर्फ इतना टैक्स देना पड़ेगा। कंज्यूमर जो है उसको ये सारा टैक्स देना पड़ेगा, सारा ऊपर का एरिया जो विच इज अलोंग द डिमांड कर्व। ना व्हाट इज द रीजन? वेल, बिकॉज यू कैन सी दैट द प्राइस इंक्रीज हैज डन वेरी लिटिल to a quantity decrease from Q1 to Q2. They are very close, and the area over there in the price increase, it's much bigger than the decrease in quantity. So if total tax over here, total tax is this area P2A, B and P1. So what would remain? Who would pay how much tax? Let us just consumer's burden. कंज्यूमर बर्डन जो होगा इस उसमें, लेट अस नेम दिस एरिया, लेट अस नेम दिस पॉइंट एज डी, जस्ट फॉर आवर कन्वीनियंस, जस्ट फॉर योर अंडरस्टैंडिंग। दिस पॉइंट, इस पॉइंट को यहाँ पे हमने डी का नाम दे दिया। जो कंज्यूमर का बर्डन होगा इसमें वो होगा P2 B D, इनफैक्ट P2A BD। ये जो एक एरिया है इस तरह का रेक्टेंगुलर, इधर देखें P2A B D, ये कंज्यूमर का टैक्स बर्डन होगा। जो बाकी एरिया बच जाता है प्रोड्यूसर का टैक्स बर्डन, इकोनॉमिक इंसिडेंस की हम बात कर रहे हैं, माइंड यू। नाउ अभी मैंने स्टैट्यूटरी इंसिडेंस की बात ही नहीं की, मैंने सिर्फ ये कहा कि टैक्स लगा दिया गया। किस पे लगाया गया डजंट मैटर, क्योंकि हमारे लिए इंपॉर्टेंट कंसिडरेशन यहाँ पे क्या है कि जो शेप है डिमांड और सप्लाई कर्व्स की वो किस तरीके की है, वो आया कि इलास्टिक है, इनइलास्टिक है। दैट इज द इंपॉर्टेंट कंसिडरेशन व्हिच विल डिसाइड हु बेयर्स द बर्डन ऑफ टैक्स। नाउ प्रोड्यूसर बर्डन ओवर हियर, दैट इज द एरिया P1 D B, and let us also name this point too. What would this point be? In fact, this is B. So we've already named this point B. Let us name this point as E. So P1 E and DB. Point is that there is a rectangular area which is much smaller than the one that is above here. It's something like this, just a rectangular area. So the end result is that P2A B D is much bigger than, this is a symbol for greater than, mathematical symbol, P1 E D and B. This is the consumer area, this is the producer area. Now why is it much bigger? The consumer and producer areas are different. Well, not surprisingly, I just went through the concept of an highly inelastic demand curve. So no matter what the price rise is, the demand wouldn't budge much. It would remain almost over there. अभी मैंने आपको पानी की सप्लाई की मिसाल दी, वाटर टैंकर्स की मिसाल दी, वाटर प्रोड्यूसर्स की, कि जितना मर्जी टैक्स वो आपसे जितना मर्जी कीमत इंक्रीज कर दे, अगर उन पर टैक्स लगाया जाता है, कीमत वो जितनी मर्जी बढ़ा दे, पानी आपने खरीदना है, वो ज़रूरत है। सो व्हाट वुड बी द एंड रिजल्ट? एंड रिजल्ट ये है कि ये एरिया इस एरिया से बड़ा है, विच इम्प्लाइज, मैथमेटिक्स में इम्प्लाइज को इस तरह भी लिखते हैं, विच इम्प्लाइज दैट इट इज द consumer who will end up with the larger tax incidence. It is the consumer who would end up with larger tax incidence. It simply owes to the fact that his demand curve is inelastic. That is why. Now, what could be a practical implementation? कोई practical मिसाल सामने आपके है क्या? हमारे सामने कोई ऐसी मिसाल है? बहुत सी मिसालें हैं. मैंने आपको एक मिसाल दी वाटर सप्लाई की कि उसके जब सख्त गर्मी के महीने होते हैं ख़ास तौर पे, तो वो डिमांड कर्व जो होती है वो हाईली इनइलास्टिक हो जाती है. तो उसमें जो मर्जी हो जाए, जो टैक्स इम्पोज करने वाले हैं उनको भी पता होता है कि पैसे जो है वो कंज्यूमर से ही निकलवाएंगे अगर प्रोड्यूसर पे इम्पोज भी करें. सिमिलरली एक और मिसाल क्या हो सकती है? एक और बड़ी अच्छी मिसाल जो है वो हो सकती है टोबैको की या सिगरेट्स की. सिगरेट्स की जो कर्व है, आपका क्या ख्याल है कि वो सिगरेट्स की डिमांड जो है, डिमांड कर्व वो क्या होगी? इनइलास्टिक होगी, यूनिट इलास्टिक होगी या हाईली इलास्टिक होगी? वेल, सिगरेट की डिमांड कर्व्स भी जो है वो नॉर्मली जो होती है, ज़्यादातर जो सिगरेट नोश होते हैं, सिगरेट पीने वाले होते हैं, ज़्यादातर के लिए, कुछ होते हैं जो कि सिर्फ शौकिया भी पीते हैं, कुछ होते हैं जो कभी कभार पीते हैं और जो इस चीज़ का ख्याल रखते हैं कीमतों का कि क्या हुआ, कीमतों को क्या नहीं हुआ. लेकिन कुछ होते हैं चेन स्मोकर्स होते हैं. ज़्यादातर लोग जो होते हैं सिगरेट के जो आदी होते हैं, उनके लिए डजंट मैटर कि कितनी कीमत होगी होती है, उन्होंने सिगरेट पीना ही पीना है. तो अगर 50 रुपये भी बढ़ जाए, 100 रुपये भी बढ़ जाए, वो सिगरेट खरीदेंगे. तो इस केस में, सिगरेट के केस में भी आप जब देखेंगे कि हुकूमत जो होती है वो भी सिगरेट पे ही टैक्सेस अप्लाई करती है, इस तरह की सिगरेट टाइप की चीज़ों पे, क्योंकि उनको पता होता है कि ये इसकी डिमांड कर्व हाईली इनइलास्टिक है. आप जितना मर्जी टैक्स उस पर इम्पोज कर दो, जितनी भी कीमत बढ़ जाए, हुकूमत को तो आमदन हो रही है टैक्स लगा के, जाहिर है, लेकिन जो कंज्यूमर है he will end up paying the burden because demand curve is inelastic. सिगरेट नोश जो होते हैं, खासतौर पे जो चेन स्मोकर्स होते हैं, उनके लिए इट्स एक्सट्रीमली डिफिकल्ट इफ नॉट इम्पॉसिबल टू गिव अप ऑन स्मोक. सो दिस इज वन एज अ पॉलिसी एनालाइजर, ये एक इंसाइट आपके पास आ गई कि अगर टैक्स की बात आती है तो मैंने ये देखना है कि इकोनॉमिक इंसिडेंस ऑफ टैक्स जो है वो कौन बेयर करेगा, उस किस पे बोझ पड़ेगा. ये इम्पोर्टेंट क्यों है? मैंने आपको पिछले लेक्चर्स में भी जो पहले हम लेक्चर्स किए हैं उसमें एक शायद मिसाल दी हो, शायद ना दी हो, जाहिर है मिसाल दी थी. वो ये इन ग्रुप्स की हमने बारे में बात की थी थ्योरी में कि ग्रुप थ्योरी भी एक होती है. कोई एक ग्रुप होता है जो कि अपने मुफाद के लिए एक पब्लिक पॉलिसी बनवाता है. अब टैक्स चूंकि पब्लिक पॉलिसी है, तो इसमें वो ग्रुप जिसको पता है कि टैक्स लागू होने वाला है, तो वो क्या करने की कोशिश करेगा? वो हुकूमत को इस चीज़ को एडवोकेट करने की कोशिश करेगा, लॉबी करने की कोशिश करेगा कि जी सपोज कोई इंडस्ट्रियल ग्रुप हो गया, वो इंडस्ट्रियल ग्रुप जो है वो हुकूमत को क्या कन्विंस करने की कोशिश करेगा? वो कहेगा कि आप उस चीज़ पे टैक्स लगाएं जिसमें डिमांड इनइलास्टिक है, यानी लोगों ने उस चीज़ को खरीदना ही खरीदना है, जो मर्जी हो जाए. क्यों? वो इसलिए क्योंकि अगर प्रोड्यूसर पे टैक्स लगाया भी जाएगा तो वो सारा जाएगा, निकलेगा कंज्यूमर से ही. तो ये एक लॉबी ग्रुप हो गया. ये इस तरीके से देखें इसके इस्तेमाल होता है इलास्टिसिटी के कॉन्सेप्ट, जो मतलब अननोइंगली वो आपको नहीं बताएगा. अक्सर लोग आपको नहीं बता सकेंगे कि इलास्टिसिटी डिमांड इनइलास्टिक है या नहीं है, सप्लाई इनइलास्टिक है या नहीं है, लेकिन उनको ये अंदाज़ा होता है कि अगर आप उनसे पूछे तो ये तकरीबन सबको अंदाज़ा होगा कि यार अगर किसी इस चीज़ पर टैक्स लगाओ, इसकी कीमत अगर 50 रुपये 100 रुपये बढ़ गई तो क्या होगा, कि मतलब लोग खरीदना छोड़ देंगे, कम हो जाएगी, क्या होगा, वो तकरीबन सबको ही अंदाजा होता है विदाउट इवन नोइंग व्हाट इलास्टिसिटी इज एंड व्हाट इट्स इम्पैक्ट इज. बट फॉर एज अ पॉलिसी एनालाइजर इट इज important for you to know this concept, that this is this concept and this is how it is applied in public policy and how it is applied in the design of the public policy. तो देखिए इसमें हमने एक जो अभी मिसाल पढ़ी वो हाईली इनइलास्टिक डिमांड कर्व की थी. तो जो जितना मर्जी टैक्स आप इस पे नाफिज कर लें, अगर कीमत जो है बहुत भी ऊपर हो जाए तो उसकी डिमांड में इतना ज़्यादा कोई फ़र्क नहीं आएगा. अब इसके बाद एक मिसाल और हम ले लेते हैं हाईली जो अभी हमने डिमांड कर्व की मिसाल ली कि जो इनइलास्टिक है, सिमिलरली आप कोशिश करें नेक्स्ट मे बी वीडियो में मैं आपसे ये शेयर करूंगा, मे बी आपको एज अ होमवर्क असाइनमेंट भी मैं दे दूं कि अगर डिमांड कर्व जो है वो इनइलास्टिक की बजाय इनइलास्टिक हो जाए तो फिर क्या फर्क पड़ेगा उससे, वुड देयर बी एनी डिफरेंस इन इट, क्या होगा उसमें, फिर जो बर्डन है वो किस पे पड़ेगा. ट्राई डूइंग दैट इट try it at home too. Now in this case what you should try in doing by yourself in this case, that I have showed the movement of supply curve. What if there is movement in the demand curve, what there is a shift in the demand curve, and demand curve is inelastic but there is a shift in it, what would happen. Try doing that. जो अभी मैंने बात की मेरे ख्याल में अभी आप लोगों से मैं शेयर कर लूँगा, वो उस चीज़ को हम लोग बना लेंगे यहीं पे, ताकि आप लोगों को फिर थोड़ा सा अंदाज़ा हो सके उस चीज़ के बारे में कि अगर उसमें मैं कोई वेरिएशन फिर आपको देता हूँ. जो दूसरा केस है कि अगर सप्लाई कर्व जो होती है वो इलास्टिक या इनइलास्टिक होती है तो उसका क्या असर पड़ेगा, वो मैं आपसे शेयर कर लेता हूँ. फिर उस इन्हीं थीम्स पे हम लोग मैं इसको वेरी करूँगा, शायद आपसे क्विज में भी पूछ लूँ, शायद आपसे होमवर्क में पूछ लूँ. सो ट्राई अंडरस्टैंडिंग दिस कॉन्सेप्ट. अच्छा, अब let's move towards another example. In this case now we'll study what happens when supply curve is inelastic. In the above example that we just studied over here, as we showed that the supply curve is inelastic, what happens when the demand curve is inelastic? Demand curve is elastic and supply curve is inelastic. Let's try to graph that over here. So we have now got a very elastic demand curve that goes something like this. A relatively elastic demand curve, but we have a relatively inelastic supply curve like this. Now relatively inelastic, I remember I said that you can tell by its steepness. It's more straight like this. Suppose this is the equilibrium point at which there is P is the price, Q is the quantity, you make a P over here, O over here, and a Q over here, the big one. So anyway, so now you have this supply and demand. Okay, so you have what we have over here is elastic demand curve and an inelastic supply curve. This is the original equilibrium price. Let's name this point as E. Now suppose any tax is imposed upon the producer or the consumer. We are not saying on whom the tax is being imposed. We are just saying that a tax is suppose a tax is imposed. So what happens when the price goes up? Or let's do it for a price that goes down. The price goes down from P to P1. It's not writing properly. There you go, P to P1, and the quantity demanded, it goes from Q to Q1. All right, so we have this this situation where this demand curve and supply curve, an elastic demand curve, highly inelastic supply curve. So suppose there is this supply curve that is inelastic, and there is some change in the price, and the price goes down, and we expect the supply to go down too over here. This is where the new supply S dash meets the demand curve. let's name this point as point. Let's extend it over here. This is E, this point is A, this point is B, this point is P2, P2B A P1, P2E P. So this is what we get. You can easily see over here that a change in price from P to P1 has induced a larger change in quantity demanded over here, and so, which is pretty much a reflection of the elasticity of the demand curve and the inelasticity of the supply curve. Now this is the area, the total tax imposed, as in this case. I'll just point it out so there is no confusion from over here. The total tax effect is shown by the area P2, B, A, P1. Now the consumer's burden, that would be the smaller area of the two, because as posited or as hypothesized by the elasticity, in this case the demand curve is highly elastic. So the change in consumer preferences, the change in consumers' demand would be much more than the change in price, or that the reaction of the producer whose supply curve is relatively inelastic. So which of these areas, although in this diagram it is not very clear, but for us, let us just take this one area. This looks the smaller one. So the consumer's burden would be P2, B, E, and P. This area. Producer's burden in this case would be the area P, E, A, P1. This area P, E, A, P1, this is nothing, this is greater than area P2, B, E, and P. This is the end result of it, and the end result is that in this case, when supply curves are relatively inelastic and the demand curves are elastic, it is the producer, not the consumer, who will be bearing more burden, the tax incidence more. This is a contrast to the above result, in which the demand curve was inelastic. Over here the demand curve is elastic and the supply curves are inelastic. So the end result would be that the tax incidence more on producer. So that is pretty much how you graph these things, but more than graphing, more important than graphing is that you understand this concept of how we go about this thing. As a policymaker, you need to be aware of this phenomenon related to tax burdens and who's going to share it, on whom is going the tax burden, on whom is it going to fall. That's technically that's known as tax incidence, and I'm sure hopefully by the end of this or by the graphic analysis, by this graphic analysis, you would have understood the difference between the two. Graphs are important. It's not that they are not that important, but more important than graphing is the fact that you understand the concept. Hopefully you have. So let's move forward to the other one. What what do we have here? Okay, what does the above graphical analysis tell us, and what lessons does it hold for tax policy? The key insight is that it is the relative elasticities of demand and supply that should help in deciding which good to tax and by how much. Relative elasticities of demand and supply, ये देखा करें कि policy maker के लिए ये important होनी चाहिए. As I've already said कि देखें कि कौन सी curve steep है, कौन सी नहीं है, elastic है, inelastic है. फिर जिस तरह जाहिर है ये डिपेंड करता है गवर्नमेंट क्या करना चाहती है पॉलिसी के थ्रू, क्या डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन पॉलिसीज जो है उस पर अमल दरामद करना चाहती है, फिर एक डिफरेंट किस्म का टैक्स आएगा. वी विल डिस्कस दिस. जाहिर है कि इन केस ऑफ डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन टैक्स कैसा होगा, इन केस ऑफ अगर सिगरेट्स पे लागू करना है तो वो टैक्स कैसा होगा. नाउ द one or two things related to this taxation is one is why is petroleum tax so heavily in Pakistan. Well, I was doing a research paper. I didn't know that, but when I was doing a research paper back in the days when I used to work with the government, to some extent I still do. But one thing that I found out and that astonished me was that petroleum in Pakistan, when petrol lands at the shores in Karachi, in Pakistan, and it reaches the petrol pump, by that time it goes through at least 5 or 6 types of taxes. Now this is ridiculous, right? You would expect only one tax or maybe even a second tax, and that also that you are aware that government has no other alternative. But over here that's like 5 or 6 taxes at once, and just on one product. Now why is that? Well, the demand curve for petroleum is pretty inelastic. One can argue that it is now elastic with it is now elastic because of the availability of compressed natural gas, which is a good substitute. You can switch over instead of the petroleum. Yes, to a certain extent that is true, but remember, in some areas of Pakistan, in most areas of Pakistan, gas is not available, CNG is not available, or if it is available, you see miles of lines of car. It's in short supply. So what does that tend to do? Now this here is another lesson which you need to keep in perspective. What that tends to do is, since there is no good substitute over here, what that tends to do is that makes the elasticity of demand more steep or more inelastic. So the governments are aware of that. Governments are aware that petroleum doesn't, there is no good substitute for petrol. So it taxes it so heavily because ultimately it would come out of the consumer. Consumers have difficulty switching over to the other modes of transportation or other fuels that can fuel their car. Now again, you can make an argument over here. Now make the distinction here. If you go to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KPK, over there is no shortage of gas. You will find gas almost everywhere. So what do you expect the supply curve, the demand curve over there to be compared to the demand curve over here in the Punjab or in Sindh or in Balochistan? How do you expect it to be? Well, you expect it to be relatively elastic, the demand curve for petrol. It's relatively elastic. It's not highly elastic, but it's relatively elastic. People have this option of compressed natural gas, CNG, which they can always use because it is available over there, except for times of load shedding, which is quite a lot. So in KPK relative to Punjab and Sindh, you would the demand, the curve elasticity, demand curves elasticity is elastic compared to over here in Punjab and Sindh because there is lesser availability of CNG. So the demand curves are relatively inelastic compared to KPK because over there you have gas available as a good substitute for petrol. So, but if you look at it overall, I'm talking about the overall scenario. The lesson over here was that even when you go from one place, one locality to the other, the demand curve or the supply curve, their relative elasticities tend to change. But I'm talking about all Pakistan. If you're talking about all of Pakistan, then the demand curve for petrol is relatively inelastic, meaning that even if there is a lot of increase or a substantial increase in the price of petroleum, you won't see such a drastic reduction because there is no good substitute. What are people going to switch to if there is no compressed natural gas? So that is why it is taxed so heavily in Pakistan, because there is no good substitute for it. This was a lesson for you too. This should be a lesson for you too, and obviously policymakers understand this. So that should make you realize why petroleum is taxed so heavily. It is because of the relatively inelastic demand curve. Okay, next one, it's in fact above the two that we already did. I placed it mistakenly placed it over there. Anyway, how can a tax have a positive impact? Normally हम जिस चीज़ से बहुत ज़्यादा जिस चीज़ के जो हमें बहुत ज़्यादा पता है, हमने जो देखी है वो ये है कि टैक्स का ज़्यादा इम्पैक्ट नेगेटिव होता है। और वो इसलिए पाकिस्तान में ज़्यादातर टैक्स का इम्पैक्ट नेगेटिव इसलिए होता है क्योंकि वो अवाम को आखिर में पे करना पड़ता है वो टैक्स। बट can the tax or can the taxation have a positive effect? Yes, it can have a positive effect if you consider the fact that tax, besides being having the primary importance of being a revenue for a government at the federal, provincial and local level, the tax has this important property that it can lead to a change in behavior. Remember the article that we read, Richard Taylor. So over here I am going to show you, we are going to go through an article that would demonstrate that tax has the power to improve the welfare, improve the overall outcome. Now we analyze the problem of tax incidences and its implication for levying taxes, but more than the consumer and the producer, perhaps it's important to look at the end result from other perspectives. Read the article. Yes, motivated by a tax, Irish spurn the plastic bags, and I've given you the email address. Sorry, not the email address. My apologies, but the link that you need to follow. This article is about the end result of taxation policy that was designed from an environmental perspective. So go ahead, click this article, take some time, read it, and come back and we'll discuss it. Again, you need to read these articles. I'm going to be asking questions. Of course, we discuss it at the end, but I'm going to be asking questions from you from this article, just to see whether you've read it or not, just to gauge, because it's easy to just say that I've read it and I've not read it. I'll be discussing it with you, but it's more important that you read it yourself. So go ahead, take some time, pause the video, we'll be back. Welcome back. I hope by this time you've already gone through the article. Another interesting one. I certainly found it very interesting. So what was it about? It was about taxation. The Irish government imposed taxes upon plastic bags. अब जिसने भी पाकिस्तान के गया हुआ है और घूमा फिरा है अपने शहर में, दूसरे शहरों में, आपने देखा होगा कि ये प्लास्टिक बैग्स पूरा एक अजाब है, और इनका एनवायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट भी जो है वो नेगेटिव है। एनवायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट इसलिए नेगेटिव है कि प्लास्टिक जो है वो मट्टी में डिसॉल्व नहीं होता, बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है, इसकी वजह से ज़मीन जो है, मट्टी जो है वो ख़राब भी होती है। फिर ये आप देखेंगे सारे, अगर किसी नाली में फंस गया, किसी उसमें फंस गया, गटर में फंस गए ये सारे, तो वो सारे चौक ऑफ हो जाते हैं, वो सारा पानी बाहर बहने शुरू हो जाता है, गंद फैल जाता है, बदबू फैल जाती है। तो ये प्लास्टिक बैग जो है आप देखेंगे कि सारे कैनाल्स वगैरह में पड़े होंगे। इट्स अ न्यूसेंस, ये एक पूरा अजाब है, लेकिन कोई यहाँ पे इस चीज़ को तवज्जो देने को तैयार ही नहीं, हालांकि सबको पता है, विच टेल्स यू अ लॉट अबाउट द प्रायोरिटीज। हालांकि ये कोई इतना मुश्किल काम नहीं है। तो इस केस में आयरिश ने क्या किया, आयरिश गवर्नमेंट ने उन्होंने प्लास्टिक बैग्स पे टैक्स इम्पोज कर दिया। टैक्स इम्पोज कर दिया कि अगर किसी ने प्लास्टिक बैग इस्तेमाल करना है तो उसको खुद खरीदना पड़ेगा और अच्छी खासी कीमत पे खरीदना पड़ेगा। तो व्हाट हैपेंड वाज कि प्लास्टिक बैग्स स्टार्टेड डिसअपीयरिंग एंड वर रिप्लेस्ड बाय bags, the bags made out of cotton or cloth, and certainly you had very clean Irish streets, very clean places in Ireland because of the imposition of tax. So that was a positive from an environmental very positive from the environmental perspective, and it basically shows you the power of taxation to change behavior. So Irish was similar to us or to all other people in the world. They used to use a lot of these bags, the plastic bags, when they were doing grocery or shopping. But once their government went ahead, despite strong opposition, stiff opposition from the sellers and the producers, as you would have learned through this article, they went ahead with it and imposed a tax upon them, that imposed a tax upon the consumer, that if you want to use plastic bags, then you will have to pay for it. And what was the end result? End result was that most of the Irish population, they threw away this thing, the plastic bags, and it was a more cleaner island, with more cleaner localities where plastic bags were less to be seen than it was before. Now, tell me something. If you, hopefully again you have read this article, what would you say about the demand curve elasticity of Irish consumers relative to plastic bags? What I mean to say over here is, or let me just rephrase it, this question, rephrase it indirectly, that the demand curve for plastic, was it inelastic, was it elastic? What did this article show you? You need to come up with this answer. I might even ask you this question in the quizzes. Think about it. And because over here what you saw was that there was a price increase, right? And we just analyzed it in graphs. So you should be able to answer this question. And to answer this question, you have to see what consumers did. So that would give you an indication, and that should hopefully give you an answer. So just a quick review of what we went through today in this lecture was the graphs, the concept of elasticity. Then I went the graph, the inelastic curves and the elastic curves. We went through the concept of elasticity. What is inelastic, elastic? How do you recognize inelasticity and elasticity? Then I graphed the simple elastic and inelastic demand and supply curves, and then we went to the imposition of tax and how that tends to affect the consumer and the producer in case of inelastic or inelastic supply curves. That was the important one, and we came up with this important insight that as a policymaker, what is most important for the policymaker to know is the relative elasticity and inelasticity of demand and supply curve. And then in the end we read this very wonderful article on the plastic bags in Ireland and what happened to them when government imposed a tax upon them. And I left you with a question which you need to come up at some time, probably before the next lecture. So hopefully you had a good lecture, and hopefully these were good insights. Take care. Allah Hafiz. We'll be back next.